Most people believe they stay in toxic relationships because they are deeply in love, because they are too forgiving, or because they simply lack the courage to walk away. While these explanations may seem reasonable on the surface, they fail to reveal the deeper psychological reality. The strongest chains that bind a person to a harmful relationship are rarely made of love alone. They are often forged long before the relationship even begins. Hidden beneath the arguments, manipulation, betrayal, and emotional pain are wounds that have never fully healed. These invisible emotional injuries quietly shape how a person sees love, how they respond to affection, and what they unconsciously believe they deserve. Without realizing it, many people enter relationships not only seeking companionship but also searching for healing. Unfortunately, when those old wounds remain unresolved, they often attract relationships that reopen them instead of repairing them. Human beings are not born understanding love. They learn what love means through their earliest experiences. During childhood, the mind absorbs emotional lessons from parents, caregivers, and family members. These lessons become the blueprint for future relationships. If a child grows up in an environment where love is consistent, safe, and emotionally available, they develop a secure understanding of connection. They learn that affection does not need to be earned through suffering, that disagreements do not threaten abandonment, and that their worth is not dependent on constantly pleasing others. They carry these beliefs into adulthood, naturally expecting respect, honesty, and emotional stability from the people they love. The story becomes very different when childhood is marked by inconsistency, neglect, criticism, rejection, emotional distance, or unpredictable affection. A child who receives love only after pleasing others begins to associate acceptance with performance. A child whose emotional needs are ignored may grow into an adult who believes their feelings are unimportant. Someone raised in an environment where affection alternated with anger or punishment may unconsciously begin to associate emotional chaos with intimacy. These experiences leave emotional wounds that remain hidden beneath the surface for years. Even after becoming adults, these wounds continue influencing decisions without conscious awareness. This is why toxic relationships often feel strangely familiar. They do not necessarily feel safe, peaceful, or healthy. Instead, they feel emotionally recognizable. The uncertainty, the emotional highs and lows, the desperate longing for approval, and the fear of losing someone all resemble emotional patterns learned long ago. The mind naturally gravitates toward what it recognizes, even when it causes pain. Familiarity is often mistaken for love. Instead of seeking emotional security, the wounded heart seeks emotional familiarity because that is what it understands. Many people wonder why they repeatedly attract emotionally unavailable partners. They ask why they keep falling for people who lie, manipulate, withdraw affection, or refuse commitment. The answer is rarely that they consciously choose suffering. More often, unresolved emotional wounds create unconscious attraction toward people who activate those same wounds. It is not that pain is enjoyable. Rather, the mind believes that repeating the familiar story may finally produce a different ending. Deep inside exists the hope that this time the unavailable person will stay, this time the critical person will approve, this time the rejecting partner will finally choose them. Every toxic relationship becomes another attempt to rewrite an old emotional story. One of the deepest emotional wounds is the fear of abandonment. People who experienced emotional or physical abandonment during childhood often develop an overwhelming fear of being left behind. As adults, this fear influences nearly every romantic relationship. Even when they recognize unhealthy behavior, leaving feels terrifying because separation activates old emotional pain. The loss of the relationship does not simply represent losing a partner. It awakens memories of earlier experiences when love disappeared unexpectedly. Their nervous system reacts as though survival itself is threatened. This is why they may tolerate disrespect, dishonesty, or emotional abuse rather than face the unbearable fear of being alone. Another common wound is the belief of not being enough. Children who constantly receive criticism or unrealistic expectations often grow into adults who never feel worthy of unconditional love. No matter how much they achieve, they continue searching for external validation. Toxic partners easily exploit this insecurity by giving occasional praise mixed with criticism. Every small compliment feels like proof of worth, while every rejection strengthens feelings of inadequacy. The person works harder and harder to earn love, never realizing that healthy love should never require constant proof of value. Some emotional wounds are created through emotional neglect rather than obvious abuse. A child may have parents who provided food, shelter, and education but rarely offered emotional warmth or understanding. Their feelings may have been ignored, dismissed, or minimized. As adults, these individuals often struggle to identify their own emotional needs because they learned that expressing emotions was useless. They become experts at sacrificing themselves for others, while silently hoping someone will eventually notice their pain. Toxic relationships thrive in this environment because the individual has become accustomed to neglecting themselves long before meeting the toxic partner. The desire to rescue others also frequently emerges from unresolved wounds. Some people grow up believing that love means fixing broken people. Perhaps they had unstable parents, addicted family members, or emotionally unavailable caregivers. They learned that love involved endless patience, sacrifice, and emotional labor. As adults, they become attracted to partners who constantly need saving. They believe that if they love enough, forgive enough, or sacrifice enough, they can finally create the stable relationship they never experienced. Unfortunately, this belief traps them in relationships where giving becomes endless and receiving becomes almost non-existent. Emotional wounds also distort personal boundaries. Healthy boundaries develop when children learn that their feelings, needs, and limits deserve respect. Without this foundation, adults often struggle to recognize when someone is crossing emotional lines. They excuse disrespect, tolerate manipulation, and remain silent during mistreatment because setting boundaries feels selfish or dangerous. Every time they ignore their own needs to keep the relationship alive, the emotional wound grows deeper. They slowly lose touch with their identity until they no longer recognize who they are outside the relationship. Perhaps the most painful consequence of unresolved emotional wounds is the confusion between love and emotional intensity. Healthy relationships often feel calm, predictable, and emotionally secure. However, for someone raised in instability, peace can feel unfamiliar or even boring. Toxic relationships, on the other hand, produce constant emotional highs and lows. Moments of affection are followed by rejection. Hope is followed by disappointment. Joy is interrupted by fear. This emotional roller coaster creates intense psychological attachment that many mistake for passionate love. In reality, what feels exciting is often simply emotional instability activating old wounds. Healing begins the moment a person realizes that the relationship is not the true source of their suffering. The relationship merely exposed injuries that already existed. This realization is not about blaming parents or reliving every painful childhood memory. It is about understanding that current emotional reactions often originate from experiences long before the present relationship. Once this awareness develops, the focus shifts away from changing the toxic partner and toward healing the wound itself. Healing emotional wounds requires honesty, patience, and self-compassion. It means recognizing unhealthy patterns without judging oneself for having them. It means learning that love should bring peace rather than constant anxiety. It means replacing the desperate need for external validation with genuine self-worth. Every step toward emotional healing weakens the attraction to toxic dynamics because the wounded parts that once sought familiar pain gradually become stronger and healthier. As self-awareness grows, people begin noticing warning signs they once ignored. They stop confusing inconsistency with mystery, manipulation with passion, jealousy with devotion, or control with protection. They recognize that genuine love never demands the sacrifice of personal dignity. Healthy partners do not require constant emotional exhaustion to prove commitment. Real intimacy grows through trust, honesty, mutual respect, and emotional safety rather than fear and confusion. Eventually, the greatest transformation occurs within. Instead of asking, "Why doesn't this person love me enough?" the question becomes, "Why have I accepted so little for so long?" That single shift changes everything. It redirects attention from chasing unavailable love toward building a healthier relationship with oneself. As old emotional wounds begin to heal, the need to recreate painful patterns slowly disappears. Love is no longer defined by suffering, sacrifice, or uncertainty. It becomes defined by respect, emotional security, kindness, and mutual growth. The truth is that toxic relationships do not begin with the toxic partner. They begin with emotional wounds that silently whisper old beliefs about worthiness, abandonment, and love. Until those wounds are healed, the same painful patterns often repeat with different faces. But once healing begins, everything changes. The person who once begged for affection begins to value peace. The one who feared being alone discovers inner strength. The one who chased impossible love finally understands that the greatest relationship they will ever build is the one they create with themselves. From that place of healing, they no longer seek someone to complete them. They seek someone who respects the wholeness they have already found. Many people believe that staying in a toxic relationship is simply a matter of weak willpower or excessive emotional attachment. They assume that if the relationship is painful enough, the person should naturally walk away. From the outside, the solution seems obvious. Friends and family often ask, "Why don't you just leave?" They see the arguments, the manipulation, the broken promises, and the emotional suffering. To them, leaving appears to be the logical decision. Yet those trapped inside the relationship experience something completely different. Even when they know they are being hurt, they continue hoping, waiting, and believing that things will eventually improve. This behavior often seems irrational, but psychology offers a powerful explanation. One of the strongest forces keeping people trapped in toxic relationships is a psychological principle known as intermittent reinforcement. It is the same mechanism behind gambling addiction and many other compulsive behaviors. Understanding this concept explains why leaving can feel almost impossible, even when the relationship is causing immense pain. Intermittent reinforcement occurs when rewards are given unpredictably rather than consistently. The human brain is naturally drawn toward uncertainty because unpredictable rewards create stronger emotional responses than guaranteed ones. When people know exactly when they will receive something positive, the excitement gradually fades. However, when rewards arrive randomly, the brain becomes intensely focused on chasing the next positive experience. This uncertainty creates anticipation, obsession, and emotional dependency. Psychologist B.F. Skinner demonstrated this principle through behavioral experiments. Instead of rewarding an action every single time, rewards were given only occasionally and without any clear pattern. Surprisingly, the subjects worked even harder for the reward. They continued repeating the behavior despite long periods without success because they believed the next reward might come at any moment. The unpredictability itself became addictive. This same psychological process appears in many areas of life. Slot machines in casinos are perhaps the most famous example. A gambler loses repeatedly but continues playing because every loss is accompanied by the possibility that the next spin could finally produce a jackpot. The occasional win creates enough excitement to erase the memory of countless failures. The brain remembers the reward far more vividly than the losses, making the person continue despite overwhelming evidence that they are losing far more than they gain. Toxic relationships often function in exactly the same way. If a toxic partner were cruel every single day, insulting every conversation, rejecting every effort, and offering no affection whatsoever, most people would eventually leave. The abuse would be obvious, and hope would disappear. But toxic relationships rarely operate that way. Instead, they alternate between pain and pleasure. After days or weeks of neglect, criticism, emotional distance, or manipulation, the partner suddenly becomes loving again. They apologize, express affection, make promises, buy gifts, or recreate memories of happier times. For a brief moment, everything feels perfect again. These positive moments become emotional rewards. They are unpredictable, unexpected, and powerful. Because they occur so rarely, they seem even more valuable. Instead of questioning why kindness is so inconsistent, the person clings to these moments as proof that the relationship can still be saved. Every affectionate message, every warm embrace, every apology becomes evidence that the loving version of the partner still exists somewhere beneath the toxic behavior. This cycle gradually changes the way the brain processes love. Instead of expecting consistency, the person begins expecting unpredictability. They become emotionally conditioned to tolerate long periods of suffering because they believe another reward is coming. Every painful experience becomes easier to justify because hope remains alive. They tell themselves that everyone has bad days, that relationships require patience, or that their partner is simply under stress. The occasional loving moments seem to outweigh the repeated emotional damage. Over time, this conditioning becomes stronger. The emotional highs feel incredibly intense because they follow periods of emotional deprivation. After days of feeling ignored, a simple compliment suddenly feels extraordinary. After weeks of rejection, one affectionate hug feels deeply meaningful. After countless arguments, a peaceful evening together feels almost magical. The brain interprets these moments as powerful emotional rewards, strengthening attachment even further. One of the most dangerous effects of intermittent reinforcement is that it slowly lowers personal standards. At the beginning of the relationship, a person may expect honesty, respect, communication, and emotional stability. They may clearly recognize behaviors they would never tolerate. However, after repeated cycles of reward and punishment, expectations begin to shrink. Instead of expecting consistent respect, they become grateful for temporary kindness. Instead of demanding honesty, they celebrate small improvements. Instead of expecting emotional safety, they settle for moments without conflict. This gradual lowering of standards happens so slowly that many people never notice it. They adapt little by little until behavior that once seemed completely unacceptable begins to feel normal. Emotional neglect becomes understandable. Broken promises become forgivable. Manipulation becomes excusable. The person starts accepting emotional crumbs because they have forgotten what genuine emotional nourishment feels like. The toxic partner may not even consciously understand this psychological process, but their behavior continues reinforcing it. They withdraw affection whenever they gain control and offer affection again whenever they sense the other person pulling away. This push and pull dynamic keeps the relationship emotionally unstable while maintaining powerful attachment. Every time the victim considers leaving, another emotional reward appears just in time to restore hope. Hope becomes the strongest chain of all. The person is no longer staying because of the present reality. They remain because of the possibility of a better future. They remember how wonderful things felt during the early stages of the relationship. They believe those moments reveal the partner's true personality, while the abusive behavior is merely temporary. They separate the good version from the bad version, convincing themselves that with enough patience, love, or sacrifice, the good version will eventually become permanent. Unfortunately, this hope often blinds them to reality. Instead of judging the relationship by consistent behavior, they judge it by isolated moments of affection. They ignore months of suffering because of one beautiful weekend together. They forgive repeated betrayals because of one sincere apology. They remain emotionally invested because every small reward feels like proof that change is finally happening. Another reason intermittent reinforcement becomes so powerful is the emotional investment already made. As months or years pass, leaving begins to feel like admitting failure. The person has invested time, dreams, energy, and emotional commitment into the relationship. Walking away means accepting that these sacrifices may never produce the future they imagined. Rather than facing this painful reality, many choose to keep investing, believing that one more effort will finally make everything worthwhile. The brain also develops powerful chemical responses during these emotional cycles. Moments of affection release dopamine, oxytocin, and other neurochemicals associated with pleasure, bonding, and emotional connection. After periods of emotional pain, these chemical surges feel even more intense. The brain begins craving them, much like it craves other addictive experiences. When affection disappears again, emotional withdrawal begins. Anxiety increases. Sadness grows stronger. The person desperately seeks another emotional reward to relieve the discomfort. This withdrawal explains why people often return even after successfully leaving. They mistake emotional withdrawal for genuine love. They believe they miss the person when, in reality, they are experiencing the brain's response to losing an addictive pattern. The discomfort feels overwhelming, leading many to reconnect with the toxic partner simply to relieve the emotional pain temporarily. Breaking the cycle requires understanding that the occasional moments of love do not erase consistent patterns of harm. One apology cannot cancel repeated betrayal. One affectionate evening cannot repair months of emotional neglect. Healthy relationships are built upon consistency, not unpredictability. Real love does not require constant emotional gambling. The first step toward freedom is recognizing the pattern instead of focusing only on individual moments. Instead of asking how wonderful the relationship feels during its best days, ask how it makes you feel most of the time. Does it bring peace or anxiety? Does it build confidence or destroy self-worth? Does it encourage growth or create fear? The overall pattern always reveals the truth more clearly than isolated moments of happiness. Recovery also involves allowing the brain to adjust to emotional stability again. At first, healthy relationships may feel unfamiliar because they lack dramatic emotional highs and lows. Consistency may seem boring compared to the emotional roller coaster of toxicity. But with time, the nervous system begins recognizing peace as safety rather than dullness. Emotional stability slowly becomes more satisfying than emotional chaos. Eventually, a profound realization emerges. The moments that kept you holding on were never enough to build a healthy relationship. They were simply enough to keep you trapped. The occasional affection was not proof of lasting love. It was the unpredictable reward that maintained the emotional addiction. Once this truth becomes clear, hope transforms into clarity. Instead of waiting for another emotional reward, You begin seeking something far more valuable: consistency, respect, trust, and genuine peace. True love never requires you to gamble with your emotional well-being. It does not force you to endure endless suffering in exchange for temporary moments of happiness. Healthy love is not unpredictable. It is reliable. It does not confuse your heart or exhaust your mind. It creates security rather than uncertainty. The moment you understand the power of intermittent reinforcement, you stop chasing emotional crumbs and begin recognizing that real love should never feel like an addiction. It should feel like home. One of the most painful experiences a person can go through is slowly losing trust in their own mind. There comes a point in many toxic relationships where the emotional pain is no longer caused only by arguments, betrayal, or neglect. Instead, the greatest suffering comes from confusion. You begin questioning your own thoughts, doubting your own memories, and wondering whether your emotions can even be trusted. You may catch yourself asking questions like, maybe I am overreacting, perhaps I misunderstood, or what if I really am the problem? These questions seem harmless at first, but they are often signs that emotional manipulation has already begun to reshape your perception of reality. This process does not happen overnight. It develops gradually through repeated psychological tactics that weaken confidence, create self-doubt, and increase dependence on the toxic partner. Among the most destructive of these tactics are gaslighting, projection, blame shifting, and emotional manipulation. Every healthy relationship is built on trust. Trust does not only mean believing another person's words. It also means trusting your own instincts, emotions, and experiences. When someone consistently respects your feelings, you naturally become more confident in expressing yourself. You feel safe sharing concerns because you know they will be heard with honesty and understanding. In toxic relationships, however, this foundation is slowly destroyed. Instead of helping you feel emotionally secure, the other person begins making you question your own reality. Gaslighting is one of the most effective forms of psychological manipulation because it attacks something fundamental: your ability to trust yourself. The term comes from a famous story in which a husband secretly changes small details around the house while insisting nothing has changed, causing his wife to question her own sanity. Today, gaslighting describes any pattern of behavior where someone repeatedly denies reality, twists facts, or dismisses another person's experiences until they begin doubting themselves. Imagine discovering evidence that your partner lied to you. You calmly ask about it, expecting an honest conversation. Instead of acknowledging the lie, they immediately deny everything. They insist you misunderstood the situation. They tell you that you are imagining things. They accuse you of being paranoid, insecure, or overly sensitive. Even when the evidence is clear, they confidently reject your version of events. At first, you remain certain of what happened. But after hearing these responses again and again, uncertainty begins to grow. This uncertainty is exactly what emotional manipulators want. They understand that a confused person is much easier to control than a confident one. Once you stop trusting your own judgment, you naturally begin relying on their interpretation of reality instead. They become the person who defines what happened, what was said, and even how you should feel. Little by little, your confidence disappears. Gaslighting rarely begins with major lies. It often starts with small incidents. You remember a conversation differently, but they insist your memory is wrong. You express hurt over something they said, but they claim you misunderstood their intention. You explain that a certain behavior upset you, yet they accuse you of being too emotional. These repeated experiences gradually teach you to suppress your instincts because every emotional reaction is met with dismissal instead of understanding. Over time, the victim begins apologizing even when they have done nothing wrong. They become afraid to express concerns because every discussion ends with them feeling guilty. They replay conversations repeatedly in their minds, trying to determine whether they truly misunderstood. They ask friends for reassurance because they no longer trust their own perception. Eventually, they lose confidence in making even simple decisions because years of manipulation have convinced them that their judgment cannot be trusted. Another powerful psychological weapon often used in toxic relationships is projection. Projection occurs when someone attributes their own unacceptable behaviors or emotions to another person instead of accepting responsibility themselves. Rather than facing their own flaws, they accuse you of possessing those same flaws. For example, someone who constantly lies may accuse you of being dishonest. A partner who secretly communicates with other people may suddenly become suspicious that you are being unfaithful. Someone who frequently loses control of their anger may insist that you are the aggressive one. These accusations seem confusing because they often have little connection to reality. Yet their purpose is not to reveal truth. Their purpose is to shift attention away from their own behavior. Projection creates emotional chaos because it forces the victim into a defensive position. Instead of discussing the original problem, they now find themselves defending against false accusations. Conversations that should have focused on accountability suddenly become arguments about the victim's character. The original issue disappears while guilt and confusion take its place. Blame shifting works in a similar way. Rather than accepting responsibility for harmful actions, the toxic partner finds ways to make everything your fault. If they lose their temper, they claim you provoke them. If they ignore your messages, they say you were too demanding. If they break promises, they insist your expectations were unrealistic. Every problem somehow becomes your responsibility. This constant blame gradually changes the victim's thinking. Instead of asking whether the other person's behavior is acceptable, they begin asking how they can improve themselves. They believe that if they become more patient, more understanding, less emotional, or more forgiving, the relationship will finally improve. They spend enormous amounts of energy trying to fix problems they never created. Emotional manipulation becomes even more powerful because it often alternates between criticism and affection. After making you feel guilty, the manipulator suddenly becomes kind again. They comfort you, reassure you, or apologize just enough to keep you emotionally attached. This creates confusion because the same person causing your pain also appears to provide relief from that pain. The brain begins associating comfort with the very individual responsible for the emotional suffering. One particularly destructive consequence of prolonged manipulation is the erosion of self-esteem. At the beginning of the relationship, you may have been confident, independent, and emotionally secure. You trusted your opinions, pursued your interests, and maintained strong relationships with friends and family. Gradually, however, constant criticism, dismissal, and emotional invalidation begin changing how you see yourself. You start believing that perhaps you really are too emotional. Maybe you are difficult to love. Maybe your expectations are unreasonable. Maybe no one else would tolerate you. These beliefs do not develop because they are true. They develop because repeated emotional manipulation slowly replaces confidence with insecurity. Isolation often strengthens this process. Toxic individuals frequently discourage close relationships with friends and family. Sometimes they do this openly by criticizing the people closest to you. Other times they create conflict whenever you spend time with others. Eventually, you begin withdrawing from supportive relationships to avoid arguments. Without outside perspectives, the manipulator's version of reality becomes even more convincing. One of the greatest dangers of emotional manipulation is that it often leaves no visible scars. Physical injuries can be photographed, treated, and recognized by others. Psychological wounds are far more difficult to identify. From the outside, everything may appear normal. Friends may wonder why you seem anxious or withdrawn without realizing the invisible battle taking place inside your mind every day. The longer manipulation continues, the more difficult it becomes to leave. Not because the victim lacks strength, but because they no longer trust themselves enough to make such an important decision. They fear they might be wrong. They wonder if they are exaggerating. They worry about hurting the other person unfairly. Ironically, the very confusion created by the manipulation becomes another reason to remain trapped. Healing begins with recognizing that your emotions are not your enemy. Feeling hurt when someone disrespects you is not weakness. Feeling anxious after repeated dishonesty is not irrational. Feeling confused after years of psychological manipulation is not evidence that you are unstable. These reactions are normal responses to abnormal treatment. Recovery also requires rebuilding trust in your own perception. This means paying attention to consistent patterns instead of accepting convenient explanations. It means believing your experiences even when someone else denies them. It means understanding that healthy relationships encourage honest communication rather than constant self-doubt. As clarity returns, something remarkable begins to happen. You stop asking whether your feelings are valid because you already know they are. You no longer need someone else's permission to recognize disrespect. You begin setting boundaries without feeling guilty. You understand that love should never require abandoning your own reality. The greatest victory over emotional manipulation is not proving the toxic person wrong. It is learning to trust yourself again. When you reclaim confidence in your own thoughts, memories, emotions, and instincts, manipulation loses its power. The confusion begins to fade, your identity slowly returns, and you realize that the person you were searching for all along was never the toxic partner. It was the version of yourself that existed before doubt replaced confidence, before fear replaced peace, and before someone convinced you that your own reality could not be trusted. The moment you choose to believe yourself again is the moment true freedom begins. Fear is one of the most powerful emotions that shape human behavior. It has protected humanity for thousands of years by warning us about danger and helping us survive. Yet not all fear serves us well. Some fears become invisible prisons that keep us trapped in situations that slowly destroy us. In toxic relationships, the greatest obstacle is often not the abusive behavior itself but the fear of what life might look like without the relationship. Many people remain in unhealthy partnerships not because they are happy, but because they are terrified of what comes after leaving. They fear loneliness, uncertainty, rejection, and the possibility that no one else will ever love them again. Alongside this fear exists another dangerous illusion, the belief that if they just love harder, wait longer, or sacrifice more, the other person will eventually change. These two forces, fear of loneliness and false hope, create one of the strongest emotional traps a person can experience. Loneliness has always been difficult for human beings. Throughout history, survival depended on belonging to a group. Being separated from others often meant danger, vulnerability, and even death. Although modern society has changed dramatically, the human brain still carries this ancient wiring. It naturally seeks connection because relationships provide emotional security and a sense of belonging. However, when this healthy desire becomes an overwhelming fear of being alone, it can drive people to accept relationships that continuously harm them. Many individuals do not simply fear loneliness, they fear what loneliness seems to say about their worth. Society constantly sends messages that happiness depends on finding a romantic partner. Movies celebrate dramatic love stories. Songs describe life as incomplete without someone special. Social media often portrays couples as symbols of success and fulfillment. These messages create the illusion that being single is somehow a failure. As a result, many people begin measuring their value by whether someone chooses them rather than by the quality of the relationship itself. When someone spends years in a toxic relationship, this fear becomes even stronger. Continuous criticism, manipulation, and emotional neglect slowly damage self-esteem. The toxic partner may repeatedly suggest that no one else would tolerate them, understand them, or love them. At first, these statements seem obviously false, but after hearing them repeatedly, especially during moments of emotional vulnerability, they begin to take root. Eventually, the victim starts believing that leaving means facing a future of permanent loneliness. This belief creates a painful paradox. The relationship causes constant emotional suffering, yet the possibility of leaving feels even more frightening. The person convinces themselves that enduring familiar pain is safer than facing an uncertain future. They tell themselves that at least they know what to expect. The unknown becomes more terrifying than the abuse itself. Another reason fear becomes so powerful is that people often confuse loneliness with emotional withdrawal. Toxic relationships create intense emotional dependency. The constant cycle of affection and rejection conditions the brain to seek validation from the very person causing the pain. When contact suddenly ends, the emotional system reacts much like it would after losing an addictive substance. Anxiety increases. Sadness becomes overwhelming. The mind desperately searches for relief. During this period, many people believe they are experiencing proof that they truly belong together. They interpret the emotional pain of separation as evidence of deep love. In reality, much of what they experience is withdrawal from an unhealthy attachment pattern. Their brain has become accustomed to constant emotional stimulation, uncertainty, and temporary rewards. Removing those patterns naturally creates discomfort, but discomfort does not necessarily mean the relationship was healthy. False hope strengthens this emotional prison even further. Hope is usually considered one of humanity's greatest strengths. It motivates people to persevere through difficult times, overcome challenges, and believe in better possibilities. However, hope becomes dangerous when it is directed towards something that consistently refuses to change. In toxic relationships, hope often transforms from a source of strength into a tool of self-deception. Most toxic relationships do not begin with cruelty. They often begin with intense affection, excitement, and emotional closeness. During the early stages, the toxic partner may appear attentive, loving, supportive, and deeply committed. These memories become incredibly important later because they create a powerful image of who the partner really is. Even after repeated episodes of manipulation or abuse, the victim continues believing that the kind and loving version still exists somewhere beneath the harmful behavior. Whenever conflict occurs, they remind themselves of those early days. They believe the relationship can return to what it once was. Every apology, every promise, every affectionate gesture renews this belief. They tell themselves that the difficult moments are temporary and that genuine love simply requires patience. Unfortunately, this mindset causes them to judge the relationship based on its potential rather than its reality. Promises of change become another powerful source of false hope. After hurting their partner, toxic individuals often express deep regret. They apologize sincerely, promise to seek help, and assure their partner that everything will be different from now on. These conversations can feel incredibly convincing because they offer exactly what the victim has been longing to hear. The possibility of finally receiving consistent love becomes irresistible. Yet meaningful change is never measured by promises alone. Real transformation requires accountability, sustained effort, personal responsibility, and consistent behavior over time. Words may inspire hope, but actions reveal truth. Unfortunately, in many toxic relationships, promises repeatedly replace genuine change. The cycle continues because apologies temporarily reduce conflict without requiring lasting personal growth. Many people also believe that their love alone can transform another person. They assume that if they become more understanding, more patient, or more supportive, the toxic partner will eventually recognize their devotion and change. This belief often comes from a generous heart, but it places impossible responsibility on one individual. No amount of love can force another human being to heal wounds they refuse to acknowledge or change behaviors they refuse to examine. Love can inspire growth, but it cannot replace personal responsibility. A person changes only when they genuinely desire transformation for themselves. External pressure, endless forgiveness, or constant sacrifice cannot create lasting change in someone who has no intention of changing. Believing otherwise often leads to years of emotional exhaustion. Another reason false hope remains so powerful is the emotional investment already made. After spending years building dreams, making sacrifices, and imagining a future together, walking away feels like throwing away a significant part of one's life. People naturally want their suffering to have meaning. They believe that if they endure just a little longer, all their sacrifices will finally be rewarded. This thinking often leads to what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy, where past investment influences present decisions even when continuing causes greater harm. Instead of asking whether the relationship is healthy today, they ask whether leaving would waste everything they have already invested. They stay because they cannot bear the thought that years of emotional effort might never produce the future they imagined. Ironically, this mindset often causes them to lose even more years chasing an illusion. Fear and hope together create a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Fear whispers that leaving will bring unbearable loneliness. Hope whispers that staying will eventually bring happiness. Between these two voices, reality becomes almost impossible to hear. The person remains trapped not because they enjoy suffering but because every possible choice appears painful. Breaking the cycle begins by questioning both fear and hope. Ask yourself whether your fear is based on reality or on beliefs planted by years of manipulation. Ask whether your hope is supported by consistent actions or only by repeated promises. Instead of focusing on who the other person could become, focus on who they consistently choose to be. Instead of imagining a future that has never arrived, examine the relationship exactly as it exists today. It is also important to understand that being alone is not the same as being lonely. Many people experience profound loneliness while sharing a home with someone who ignores, criticizes, or manipulates them. Emotional isolation inside a relationship can be far more painful than physical solitude after leaving it. In contrast, healthy solitude creates space for healing, self-discovery, and personal growth. It allows people to rebuild their confidence without constant emotional interference. As healing progresses, the fear of loneliness gradually loses its power. You begin discovering interests that were forgotten, friendships that were neglected, and strengths that had been buried beneath years of self-doubt. Slowly, your identity expands beyond the relationship. You realize that your happiness does not depend on another person's approval. Your sense of worth no longer rises and falls according to someone else's behavior. Eventually, hope itself changes. Instead of hoping that a toxic person will become someone different, you begin hoping for something healthier. You hope for peace instead of chaos. You hope for respect instead of manipulation. You hope for honesty instead of deception. Most importantly, you begin believing that you deserve these things without having to earn them through endless sacrifice. The greatest freedom comes when you no longer stay because you fear being alone, and you no longer wait because you believe someone else will magically change. You recognize that your future is not determined by another person's choices but by your own courage. You understand that real love never asks you to abandon yourself in exchange for temporary hope. It encourages growth, protects your dignity, and brings emotional safety rather than constant uncertainty. When fear no longer controls your decisions and false hope no longer clouds your judgment, you begin seeing the relationship clearly for the first time. You realize that the life waiting beyond the toxic relationship is not empty. It is full of possibility, healing, self-respect, and genuine peace. The loneliness you feared becomes temporary, while the freedom you gain has the potential to last a lifetime. Only then do you understand that choosing yourself was never an act of selfishness. It was the beginning of finally living the life you deserved all along. One of the biggest misconceptions about healing is believing that time alone solves everything. People often say that wounds heal with time, but time itself changes very little if unhealthy patterns continue. A person can spend years emotionally attached to someone who is no longer part of their life. They may replay old conversations every day, imagine different endings, or secretly hope the other person will come back changed. Although the relationship has ended physically, it continues emotionally. Healing requires active participation. It demands conscious choices that gradually retrain the mind and heart. The first stage of recovery begins with accepting reality exactly as it is, not as you wish it could be. This may sound simple, but it is often one of the hardest emotional tasks. After leaving a toxic relationship, the mind naturally focuses on pleasant memories. It remembers vacations, laughter, affectionate messages, and moments when everything seemed perfect. Painful memories slowly fade into the background while positive experiences become brighter. This selective memory creates dangerous confusion because it convinces you that perhaps the relationship was not as harmful as it truly was. The human mind dislikes emotional pain. Whenever possible, it searches for comfort, even if that comfort comes from an unhealthy source. This is why many people suddenly begin questioning their decision after leaving. They wonder if they were too impatient. They ask whether they overreacted. They imagine that perhaps things could still work if they gave the relationship one more chance. These thoughts are completely normal, but they should not be mistaken for truth. They are often signs that the emotional bond has not yet been broken. Accepting reality means looking at the entire relationship instead of isolated moments. It means remembering the repeated patterns rather than temporary improvements. It requires asking honest questions. Did this relationship consistently make me feel respected? Did I feel emotionally safe? Was trust present most of the time, or only during short periods? Did I become a healthier version of myself, or did I slowly lose confidence and peace? These questions help replace fantasy with clarity. Another essential part of healing is creating emotional distance. Physical separation alone is rarely enough. Many people continue checking social media, rereading old messages, looking at photographs, or asking mutual friends for updates. Every small connection keeps the emotional wound open. It is similar to trying to heal a physical injury while reopening it every day. Recovery becomes much slower because the brain never receives the opportunity to adjust to life without constant reminders. Choosing complete distance is often misunderstood as cruelty or immaturity. In reality, it is an act of self-protection. Boundaries are not punishments. They are tools that allow healing to begin. Just as a broken bone requires stability before becoming strong again, a wounded heart requires space to recover without constant emotional disruption. The first weeks after separation are usually the most difficult. During this period, emotions often become more intense rather than less. Anxiety increases. Loneliness feels overwhelming. Sleep may become difficult. Everyday routines suddenly seem empty. Many people interpret these experiences as proof that they made the wrong decision. However, these feelings often represent emotional withdrawal rather than genuine love. For months or even years, the brain became accustomed to constant emotional stimulation. Every message, argument, apology, and reconciliation created powerful emotional responses. When those experiences suddenly disappear, the nervous system struggles to adapt. It craves the familiar emotional pattern even when that pattern was painful. Understanding this process helps prevent impulsive decisions. Emotional withdrawal is temporary, but returning to a toxic relationship often restarts the entire cycle. Developing new daily routines becomes one of the most effective ways to support recovery. Toxic relationships frequently consume enormous amounts of emotional energy. Conversations revolve around conflict, anxiety, reassurance, and uncertainty. After leaving, this emotional space feels strangely empty. Instead of allowing that emptiness to pull you back, it can become an opportunity for growth. Simple habits begin rebuilding emotional stability. Regular exercise reduces stress while strengthening confidence. Reading introduces new perspectives that challenge old beliefs. Learning new skills reminds you that personal growth is still possible. Spending time with supportive friends restores healthy human connection. Every positive experience gradually teaches the brain that peace can exist without emotional chaos. Healing also requires grieving, and many people underestimate this stage. Grief is not limited to losing someone through death. It also appears whenever important dreams disappear. After leaving a toxic relationship, you are not only grieving the person. You are grieving the future you imagined together. You are grieving the family you hoped to build, the memories you expected to create, and the life you believed was possible. Allowing yourself to mourn these losses without judgment is an important part of recovery. Suppressing emotions rarely speeds healing. Some people try to stay constantly busy to avoid thinking about the relationship. Others rush into new romances hoping another person will erase the pain. Although distraction may provide temporary relief, unresolved emotions often return later. True healing involves acknowledging sadness, disappointment, anger, and regret without allowing those emotions to control your future. Perhaps the most important stage of recovery is rebuilding your identity. Toxic relationships slowly erase individuality. Over time, many people stop pursuing hobbies they once loved. Friendships fade. Personal dreams are postponed. Decisions become centered around avoiding conflict rather than pursuing happiness. Eventually, life begins revolving almost entirely around the relationship. When the relationship ends, many people discover they no longer know who they are. This realization can feel frightening, but it also creates an extraordinary opportunity. Recovery invites you to ask questions that may have been ignored for years. What truly brings me joy? What values matter most to me? What goals did I abandon? What kind of life do I genuinely want to build? Rediscovering yourself often begins with small actions. You return to activities you once enjoyed. You reconnect with people who genuinely care about your well-being. You explore interests that have nothing to do with romantic relationships. Little by little, your identity expands beyond the role of someone's partner. Confidence begins growing not because another person validates you, but because you recognize your own strengths. Learning self-compassion is equally important. Many survivors blame themselves for staying too long. They wonder why they ignored warning signs or tolerated disrespect. While these questions are understandable, endless self-criticism only prolongs healing. Every decision you made was influenced by the emotional knowledge you possessed at that time. Instead of judging your past self, thank that version of yourself for surviving until greater awareness became possible. Forgiveness also plays a significant role, but it is often misunderstood. Forgiving someone does not mean excusing harmful behavior or inviting them back into your life. Forgiveness simply means releasing the emotional burden that keeps you connected to the past. Holding on to resentment gives the toxic relationship continued influence over your emotional world. Letting go is not something you do for the other person. It is something you do to reclaim your own peace. As healing continues, your understanding of love begins to change. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You no longer believe that constant anxiety is proof of passion. You realize that healthy love feels calm rather than chaotic. It encourages honest communication instead of emotional games. It creates trust instead of suspicion. It allows individuality instead of demanding self-sacrifice. One remarkable transformation occurs when your standards begin rising again. Behaviors you once accepted become unacceptable. You recognize manipulation more quickly. You establish clear boundaries without excessive guilt. You understand that respect is not something to be earned after endless effort. It is a basic requirement of every healthy relationship. Eventually, you reach a point where thoughts of the toxic relationship no longer control your emotions. Memories may still exist, but they no longer define your identity. Instead of feeling trapped by the past, you appreciate the lessons it taught you. The experience becomes part of your story without becoming the center of your life. The greatest victory is not simply finding another relationship. The greatest victory is becoming emotionally whole whether you are single or partnered. When you truly heal, you stop searching for someone to rescue you because you have already learned how to stand on your own. You no longer seek validation from people who cannot provide it. You no longer confuse suffering with devotion. You choose relationships based on peace, mutual respect, honesty, and shared growth rather than emotional desperation. Healing from a toxic relationship is not a straight path. There will be difficult days, moments of doubt, unexpected memories, and emotional setbacks. But every step forward strengthens your ability to choose differently. Every healthy boundary reinforces your self-worth. Every act of self-respect weakens the patterns that once kept you trapped. In the end, breaking free is not merely about ending one relationship. It is about ending an old version of yourself that believed love required endless sacrifice. It is about becoming someone who understands that real love begins with self-respect. When you rebuild your identity, restore your confidence, and learn to value your own peace, you discover a truth that changes everything. The greatest relationship you will ever create is the one you build with yourself. From that foundation, every future relationship becomes a choice rather than a necessity, and that is the moment true emotional freedom begins.